Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. For a man accused of a gruesome triple murder and said to be involved in drug smuggling on a massive scale, Michael Steele seemed to be living a life that would bore a hermit. Dibley's men watched him going to the shops, pottering about in the grounds of his home, going out for the odd meal with Jackie Street, visiting his ex-wife or sister-in-law, visiting Sarah Saunders, and then pottering about once again. Yet despite finding nothing out of the ordinary, Dibley found himself under enormous pressure to arrest Steele there and then. A lot of people in my team were saying that the gun that had been used for the murders would be in a case above the mantelpiece in his house. They reckoned it would be a real trophy, that he'd definitely hang on to it. All we had to do was raid him and the case would be solved. I didn't agree. From what I knew of Steele, he was much too clever to have anything like that lying around. The clothes, the shoes, the guns, anything that could link him to the murders would have been destroyed almost immediately. If we'd picked him up, he would have just sat on his hands and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." No comment all the way. It was too risky to even contemplate. The one possible advantage we had was that Steele had no idea we were onto him. An arrest would spoil that. My bosses would have loved to have brought him in. The press would have loved it. The families of the dead men would have loved it. But the time just wasn't right. Instead, Dibley decided to let the job run long term, doing nothing more proactive than watching, waiting and building up a picture of Steele's gang. Williams and Corey had already been identified as key members of Steele's smuggling team by customs, but that didn't mean they were involved in the murder. Dibley, however, was convinced that Steele had not acted alone. The way I saw it, Steele couldn't have been on his own because there was no way that he would have risked getting into the Range Rover with a gun. Even if it was a sawn-off, then it still would have been bulging out under his raincoat or trouser leg. It would have been really obvious. And even if he did find a way of concealing it, he'd never be able to get it out quickly enough to take out all 3 men by surprise. There had to be at least 2 killers, Steele in the car itself and another man hiding in the bushes down the lane with 2 guns. That way, as Steele got out the car, the other man could hand him a gun and then lean in and start shooting. I also felt there was at least one more person involved because of the question of transportation to and from the murder scene. Steele was easy. He had arrived in a Range Rover, but what about the other man? He must have been hiding down the lane for a while, at least half an hour. Would he risk parking his own car somewhere nearby or down the lane itself? Unlikely. It was only a small risk, but if a member of the public or worse still a policeman saw it, thought it was suspicious and made a note of the number plate, then it would be all over. There's also the question of your state of mind after you've done something like that. No matter how cold and unemotional you are, you wouldn't want to do anything to draw attention to yourself as you're driving away from the scene. The only possible solution was to have a third member of the gang parked up somewhere and have them pick Steele and the other killer up once the deed was done. Dibley took his theory one step further. He predicted that when an arrest was eventually made, it would be the getaway driver who would prove to be the weak link. Whether he knew the killings had been about to take place or not, he would have taken no actual part in it. He would have had to have been away from the scene, and would therefore do everything he could to distance himself from the actual crime. If anyone was going to talk, it would be him. It was less than 10 days after the murder, and Dibley, in an astonishing bit of classic detective work, had managed to work out exactly what had happened and pretty much who was responsible. And he didn't have a single scrap of evidence to prove it. Just before Christmas, a member of Dibley's team pulled him to one side and asked him how much he knew about the way mobile phones work. Dibley admitted he didn't know that much and asked why. The man explained that whenever a mobile phone is switched on, it automatically sends a signal to the nearest radio beacon so that the network knows where the phone is. The information is instantly transferred to a central computer. When a call comes in for that particular phone, it is sent out via the same beacon. If a phone moves out of a particular area, it continues sending out signals until it is picked up by the next nearest beacon. The man could see his boss's eyes were starting to glaze over, so he quickly got to the point. If Steele and his accomplices had their mobile phones with them on the day of the murder, then they would have logged onto the beacon nearest Workhouse Lane at some point that evening. They'd be able to see what time Steele got there, what time he left, and who was with him. They'd be able to check his movements earlier in the day, as well as see who he was in contact with, and compare that to the movements of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. It sounded brilliant, almost too good to be true. I asked him what he needed to compile the information, and he scratched his chin for a second, then said just a couple of computer terminals and a corner of the incident room. I told him to go for it and to keep me informed on a daily basis. It took a few weeks to track down all the different sources of information and work out the best way of putting it together, but when the first printouts emerged, they were beyond Dibley's wildest expectations. You couldn't see and you couldn't hear what was being said, but you could follow everyone's movements, or to be exact, the movements of their phones throughout the day, and see all the different sides slowly coming together and ending up at Workhouse Lane. It was incredible. It all started around 2 p.m, with a call from Steele's landline to Nichols' mobile, which at the time was out in Sunbury on the site close to Heathrow. 11 minutes later, Steele called Wombs at G&T in Ipswich. Soon after that, there were calls from a payphone at the Sawhorse Inn, a pub just down the road from G&T, to Tucker's mobile and then Tate's mobile as Wombs set about arranging the meeting for that evening. The call to Tate's mobile was brief and followed a few minutes later by a much longer call to a payphone close to Tate's house, an attempt to get around any bugging devices that may have been planted. After that, there were a series of calls between Steele and Nichols, with the latter getting ever closer to Essex until both his phone and Steele's connected with the beacon nearest to Mark's Tay. At 6:44 p.m, Tate's mobile received a call from the landline belonging to Sarah Saunders. At 1 minute to 7, Wombs' mobile connected to the beacon nearest Workhouse Lane for a 3-second call to the mobile of Darren Nichols, as he asked to be picked up from the murder scene. Although no calls had been made or received by Steele's phone during the time the murders were believed to have taken place, the printout showed it too had logged itself onto the beacon nearest Workhouse Lane around the crucial time. The phone records not only fingered Steele and Wombs as the killers and Nichols as the getaway driver, but also put Corey in the clear. When you sat down and looked at it all, it seemed to be pretty damning evidence, but as far as I was concerned, it didn't change a thing, says Dibley. The pressure to arrest Steele was on again, but all he would have said was that he didn't have his phone with him that day. His wife borrowed it and went on a drive around Essex. It wasn't enough to prove any different, so all we could do was add it to the pot and continue with the long-term plan. It was another piece of the jigsaw, but the picture was still far from complete. In fact, short of getting Steele to throw his hands up and shout out, "I did it, it was me all along," there didn't seem to be any way to close the case. But we had to keep going. The alternative is you pack up your bags and say we think he's done it, but we can't prove it, so let's just leave it. And that would have suited a lot of people. All the time I was being asked, what are you worried about? Why are you wasting your time on scum? Whoever did this has done the whole population a favour. It was on the evening of Thursday the 15th, February 1996, shortly after the 9 o'clock news had come on air, that a relaxed and confident Michael Steele received the first telephone call. The voice was not one that he recognised, but Steele listened patiently as the softly spoken Irishman on the other end of the line explained that he had been trying to track him down for several weeks. Along with his brother John, the caller Billy had been part of an organisation working closely with Pat Tate. Unbeknown to Steele, all the merchandise that he had been shipping into the country and passing to Tate had eventually made its way to the Emerald Isle. When the enterprise started up, Billy and John had been led to believe that fresh supplies would be reaching them on a regular basis, and with that in mind, they had invested a good deal of their own money into the venture to ensure its smooth operation. But now, with Tate dead, the brothers had suddenly found themselves out of pocket and out of stock. Everyone had assumed that Tate was working with the two brothers from London. Perhaps Billy and John were linked to them. The initial request was simple enough. Would Steele be willing to supply the same goods at the same bargain price Tate had offered to them directly? If that wasn't possible, then how about delivering the goods at a reduced rate to a local third party whom they would nominate? Or if Steele himself had a suggestion for the best way to do business, they would be more than happy to listen. Up until that point, Steele had said nothing more than hello. He held his silence for a moment longer, and when he finally chose to speak again, he chose his words carefully. "I haven't got the faintest idea what you're talking about, mate," and promptly put the phone down. The second call came 2 days later, and the first threat followed almost immediately. "Pat owed us £40,000, said Billy, the voice having suddenly developed a much harder edge. "We want our fucking money. Where is it? This isn't a game." even under pressure, still remained incredibly cool and calm. "I think the police have got it. Why don't you talk to them?" he said, and promptly put the phone down. After that, it all started to fall apart. "Don't mess with us, Mickey," hissed John the following evening. "We want our money, or you'll be sorted out just like Pat was." Still had to stifle a giggle. The idea of someone threatening him with the same fate as Pat was, under the circumstances, so ludicrous it almost brought tears to his eyes. Over the next week or so, the calls became more and more frequent, and Billy and John made more and more references to the end of the IRA ceasefire and the bombing of Canary Wharf. The implication was obvious, but still wasn't going to be pushed around by anyone. The threats became even more direct. "You're going to have to immigrate," Billy told him one day. "That's the only way. I'm going to have to follow these matters up. And watch your car. I have A-levels in whacking people." Steele's response was curt and to the point. "I've told you, I don't know what you're talking about. Why don't the pair of you just fuck off and bother someone else?" Billy just laughed. "You better watch your back. The ceasefire's gone, Mickey, and your ceasefire's gone." A few days later, a tearful Sarah Saunders called Steele. Billy and John had taken him at his word and called her up to make similar threats. Saunders, unaware at first that Steele had also been contacted by the brothers, had gone straight to Basildon Police with the phone number they had given her. Their response did little to comfort her. Not only had the number traced to a well-known Republican bar in Belfast, but Billy and John, both identified as known members of a major terrorist cell, had recently travelled to the mainland. They had been traced entering the port, but the special agents tailing them had now lost track. No one knew where they were. Saunders was terrified, but Steele was full of doubts. Would terrorists really hold him responsible for the £40,000? Could they really have been dealing with someone as unreliable and as unpredictable as Tate? Would they really be phoning him up and threatening him so openly on the phone? None of it made sense. He took a gamble and did nothing. And almost as soon as they had started, the phone calls stopped.